Hi, my dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshat Kedoshim. Over the past 2 years, many social issues arose which created civil unrest. Moral ambiguity often arises when two conflicting moral imperatives clash with each other. In the case of the pandemic, preserving the individual civil liberties was one moral imperative, whereas public safety was a conflicting moral imperative. A person gets on a plane and doesn't want to be coerced to wear a mask, which is uncomfortable and makes it difficult to breathe. Another person works for a company that requires all of its employees to be vaccinated, but the individual has questions about the vaccine, which has been hastily brought to market and hasn't been properly tested. Schools and houses of worship are shut down, denying children the ability to leave their homes and benefit from social interaction, a vital ingredient for mental health, and denying people their basic civil right to congregate for religious purposes. Clearly, many people felt that their civil liberties were trampled upon during this pandemic, but at the same time, public safety was at risk, and the stakes were actual life and death. Passions flare whenever there are conflicting moral imperatives. Conservatives and liberals both have legitimate moral concerns that impel them to advocate for their moral interests. Having liberal moral values doesn't make you a bad person just because your moral concern doesn't take my conservative moral concern into consideration, and vice versa. Social psychologist Jonathan Haidt writes about this divide in his important work, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. In it, Haidt argues that people are too quick to denigrate other points of view without giving those views full consideration. We spoke about this a few years ago in relation to the divide between Yosef and Yehuda, in that these two sons of Yaakov represent two personas of the moral individual. The Yosef persona takes a universal approach to humanity and tries to spread Judaism and holiness throughout the world, which is a virtuous and noble objective. The Yehuda persona takes the opposite approach and sees the outside world as a threat to the preservation of Judaism, and thus builds high protective walls around the Jewish community. This is an equally virtuous and noble objective. In discussing the prohibition of Molech, an ancient practice of using one's children in sacrificial service, the Torah in Parshat Kedoshim is very exhortative in making sure that justice is meted out against the individual who performs this abominable rite, in that that person receives the death penalty. But then the Torah states something that it doesn't say for the other equally objectionable acts of this section of the Torah. The Torah states in chapter 20, verses 4 and 5, V'im halem ya'alimu am haaretz et einehem min ha'ishahu. If the general population hides its eyes from this man who gives his child to Molech and does not kill him, then I, God, will pay attention to that person and his family. I will cut him off together with all those who lust after Molech from among their nation. Why does the Torah only express its concern over people hiding their eyes from Molech and not from the other bad practices detailed in this section, like bestiality or cursing one's parents? I believe the answer lies with a 12th century commentator, Sefer Yereim, by the Tosafist Rabbi Eliezer of Metz. Many commentaries debate what exactly one does with their child in the worship of Molech. Is it human sacrifice? Is it idolatry? Rabbi Eliezer maintains that it's neither. He states Molech is not idolatry. Rather, it is prohibited simply because it is a Canaanite ritual that Hashem does not wish for us to imitate. The ritual consisted of taking an object, calling it Molech, but not for purposes of deification. They would then take their child and simply pass the child in front of the object. This is why onlookers from the community, I believe, might be tempted to look the other way. What, after all, is the person doing that is so terrible? No, he's imitating something from the Canaanites, and it's narishkeit anyway. What's the big deal? The Alshich argues that many of the community members would argue that putting someone like this to death is morally wrong. Why should we put a person to death for doing something so innocuous? Let's not have his blood on our hands. The fact is, this is a morally ambiguous commandment. The person hasn't physically harmed their child, nor have they committed idolatry. And yet, Hashem says that this is an intolerable behavior for a Torah society. We might have similar moral questions about many other mitzvot where the Torah condemns the violator. We may not always understand why the Torah treats certain acts so harshly, but we nevertheless defer to the Torah's definition of morality. As such, when there are conflicting moral interests, one can find often a solution to their quandary by consulting the halacha and seeing what should or should not be done. Obviously, there will always remain certain gray areas even within the halacha, but at least we have a guidepost and an arbiter for the very big issues. Nonetheless, emotions will run high and doubts will linger when those ambiguities are present, especially when it comes to issues like Molech, where innocent children are involved. Tempers and emotions are flaring again over the recent leak of a document from the U.S. Supreme Court, which proposes to overturn Roe versus Wade, the landmark decision of 1973 that legalized abortion throughout the United States. Those who support abortion rights argue for personal civil liberty. It is a woman's body, and she has a right to do with it as she chooses. The opponents say that killing an unborn fetus is nothing less than the murder of a human being. I'm not here to debate that issue right now. I've had my share of debates, and I'm not interested in rehashing all of the halachic nuances, which are complex and not always straightforward. Suffice it to say that in most, but not all cases, abortion is not halachically sanctioned. Separate from this discussion, there's also the question whether or not a governmental ban on abortion is a good thing for society, in light of the minority of situations when abortion is mandated halachically. This is also being debated even within our own religious communities. What I would point out is that the reason why passions are so flared is because neither side is willing to take the other side's arguments into consideration. Here are two moral truths that create an impossible impasse. The first moral truth is a person should have autonomy over her own body, provided that she is not self-destructive. Coercing a human being to subject herself to an unwanted childbirth can be as torturous as coercing someone into servitude. But truth number two is a person may not take an innocent life. Those who advocate for abortion rights simply ignore the possibility that an unborn fetus has any status of a living human being. Those who advocate for a ban on abortion argue that autonomy over one's body has to take a back seat to the prohibition of murder. Yet there's no proof that an unborn fetus has the full status of a human life either. The truth is, no one other than the Creator can arbitrate that question. If individuals were to take the opposing arguments into consideration, a calmer and more rational discussion could take place in the public sphere. Unfortunately, as Dr. Haidt has observed, people are not willing to listen to each other, especially when the stakes are so high in regard to one's civil liberties and personal rights. I have one simple suggestion for this and so many other morally ambiguous issues of the day. If you feel passionately about something, whether it's vaccines or masking or abortion or politics, don't lose yourself to those emotions. I've seen so many people over the last 2 years lose it over their strongly held views and really behave irrationally. If you do, then no matter how correct you may be, you've already lost. Instead, listen to the other side, digest it, and practice the humility of acknowledging that perhaps there is truth to the other side of the argument. Your convictions may run deep, but realize that truth is objective. There's no such thing as my truth or your truth. So that blocking the other side of the argument by yelling and stomping up and down does not make you more objectively correct. In fact, the more emotional you become about an issue, the more you may be revealing just how morally uncertain you are about your position. Finally, when you realize that you are at an impasse because there are cogent moral arguments to be made for both sides of a position, consult the Torah. If you don't have sufficient knowledge of the Torah, consult someone who does and who can guide you to sources that discuss the issues dispassionately and objectively. By making room for others, we arrive at truth. It is also how we make a Kiddush Hashem. And so, dear friends, may our efforts at listening to each other help us bring the redemption speedily. B'mehera b'yameinu. Amen. Here's wishing you a beautiful Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom.